So the information and statistics collected for the first time. So it is collected by the researcher for the first time by field survey are called as primary data. So there are numerous aspects involved in the collection of primary data, like taking the decision such as how, when, what and why to collect. So if we want to solve a particular problem for the first time, he has to collect all the raw data. Hello everyone, I am Harshita, lecturer, Department of Commerce, Vidhyaashram First Grade College, the Temple of Excellence, Mysuru. My dear students, today we are in the yet another session of this particular unit of the subject Business Research Method, and the unit is Unit 3 Data Collection. So we have already discussed few of the concepts in a previous session. Let us quickly recall what we have discussed. So in a previous session, I have discussed this topic, that is we were discussing about the secondary data. So what do you mean by secondary data? The data which is collected by the researcher not for the first time. So it will be already collected by some other person or some other organization. From there the researcher is going to take the data. So they are termed as what? Secondary data. So under secondary data there are two types. So the first one is internal secondary data, other one is external secondary data. Now what do you mean by internal secondary data? So here the researcher is going to collect the information not for the first time but inside the organization, that is within the organization, which has been already collected by some other person or organization. So here inside the organization itself, so it will be collected by some other organization or some other individuals. So here the researcher is going to take that information, but you have to remember here, so it will be taken from inside the organization. So it is called as internal secondary data. Now coming to the external secondary data, so here this is also one of the type of secondary data where the researcher is going to collect the secondary data outside the organization. So we have already discussed few of the sources of internal secondary data as well as external secondary data in a previous session. In today's session we shall continue with few more topics here. So I have told you I am going to discuss what are the advantages as well as disadvantages of primary as well as secondary data, and at the same time what is the main difference between primary data as well as secondary data. So let us discuss in detail today. Now what do you mean by primary data? So I have already told you. So these are the data or information which is collected by the researcher for the first time. So it is also called as raw data. So which is not been published anywhere, or the researcher will not get information from any other sources under primary data, because he has to collect himself through primary sources. So they are termed as what? Primary data. So the information and statistics collected for the first time. So it is collected by the researcher for the first time by field survey are called as primary data. So this we have already discussed. So primary data means what? The data which is collected by the researcher for the first time. So it will not be there before that. So earlier research activity will not provide such type of information. For the first time the researcher is going to collect the information, and that too it is through field survey. So they are termed as what? Primary data. So in this, the researcher will contact the respondents personally. So what he will do? How he is going to collect the information? He is going to collect the information by meeting the respondents personally. So this is under personal interview, where in case of telephone interview, he is directly contacting the respondent through telephone. And a mail interview, he is going to contact through mail. Next, other one was panel interview, where he is going to conduct a panel and he is going to collect the information from the respondents. So here he is going to meet the respondent personally, or he will have a direct contact with the respondents. Now who are respondents? The person from whom the researcher wants to collect the information. So they are termed as respondents. So in this, the researcher will contact the respondents personally. So either personally or through telephone, and collect the first hand information. So he will collect the first-hand information for a specific research problem, the primary data contains the original attribute. So here I have told you it is a raw data which is collected from the respondents. So it is a data and it is also called as what? First hand data, because it is collected by the researcher for the first time. So let us see a definition here. According to David J. Luck and others, the primary data is the information. So it is an information that was first reviewed. So this was first reviewed as well as recorded by the researcher in their experience. So what he is going to do? For the first time, he is going to collect the information. At the same time, he is going to review that information. Now we shall see few of the advantages here. So if you know the meaning, you can directly go on writing the advantages. So the first advantage is that you can get the accurate result, because the researcher himself is going to contact the respondent and collect the information. So the raw data the researcher wants, it can be directly obtained through this primary data. So data collected is very specific to the problem and is useful. Suppose if a researcher is going to conduct a particular research activity on a particular topic, so if we refer some other secondary data, what happens? The exact information what he wants will not be given. So here the exact information what he wants, it cannot be collected, because the other researcher might have done some other work on a same topic. So you can't get the exact information. But in case of primary data, what the researcher wants, it can be exactly extracted from the respondents. And the second one is quality. So if you see the quality when compared to primary as well as secondary, so primary data's quality is more than secondary data. So quality of the data collected is not doubtful and it is meaningful. In the sense, there is more accuracy in the collection of data, because the researcher will get the exact data what he wants. At the same time, what happens? The quality as well as accuracy will be more under primary data. Next one, it may lead to the discovery of addition data and information during its collection. So it is not only confined to a particular information what the researcher wanted to collect. So by speaking to the respondents, he may get some extra information also. So it may help the researcher in further research activities. So these are the few advantages, and few more advantages I have already discussed in our previous sessions. Now coming to the disadvantage. So let us see what are the disadvantages of primary data. So there are numerous hassles involved in the collection of primary data, like taking the decision such as how, when, what and why to collect. So the collection of primary data is not an easy task. It requires huge time, huge amount is required. At the same time, meeting each and every respondent and collecting the data is very difficult. So if the time duration is only 2 months, in that situation, if he wants to meet 100 of respondents, it is very difficult to collect the primary data. At the same time, there are a lot of drawback in the primary data. At the same time, we have seen the advantage also. So if you see the drawback here, collection of primary data, like taking the decision. So we have to take the decision that how, when, what and why to collect. So how to collect the data. So when to collect the data, what to collect and how to collect. So these are the main aspect, whereas when compared to secondary data, they are the ready-made information which has been already collected by some other individual or organization. But here the researcher has to have that much of skill, because he wants to meet each and every respondent. So for the first time he is going to collect the information, so he will get the raw data, but the difficulty is also there while collecting the data. Next one is the cost. So this I have already discussed. The cost and time involved in collecting the data is very difficult, because the cost involved. So in order to meet each and every respondent and collect the data, it is very difficult. At the same time, the time requirement also. So it requires huge time or lot of time to collect the data. So the cost involved in the collection of primary data is very high. So these are the few drawbacks and we have already discussed. So let us discuss when we are going to discuss the difference between primary and secondary data. Now coming to the secondary data. Now what do you mean by secondary data? So these are the data which is not collected by the researcher for the first time. So it has been already collected by some other person from where the researcher is going to take that information. They are termed as what? Secondary data. And it is also called as what? Ready-made data. So the data already collected by other person or organization are called as what? Secondary data. So it has been already collected by some other person. So this data is available in various forms. So we have seen in our previous session what are the various forms or sources of collecting the secondary data. It may be press report, article published in the daily newspaper, periodicals, journals and publications from the universities or educational institutions will also publish certain articles and publication by the local bodies. So there are number of sources to collect the secondary data which has been already collected by some other individual or organization from where the researcher is going to take and he is making use of it. So they are termed as what? Secondary data. Secondary data is of two types. One is internal secondary data and external secondary data. So this I have already discussed now. Now coming to the advantages of secondary data. Let us see what are the advantages as well as disadvantages of secondary data. Now the important advantages of secondary data is explained below here. So the first one is, in this method, the data is readily available. So when compared to primary data, in primary data what the researcher has to do? So if he want to solve a particular problem, for the first time he has to collect all the raw data. But in case of secondary data, what happens? So this data is readily available. So it is readily available because it has been collected by some other person or individual or organization before the research have been taken place. So in this method, the data is readily available and ready to use the material for reference purpose. Here the researcher is just going to refer that because it has been already there. The information is systematic and worthy to study. So if the researcher does not have sufficient time as well as if he is happy with the information what he got through secondary data, then this method is very useful. Next, second one, it saves time and effort of the researcher. Of course, this is a very important advantage here when compared to primary data. And a primary data, since he is going to collect the information for the first time, so he requires lot of time as well as money. But in case of secondary data, he is just going to refer that information. So it saves time as well as effort of the researcher. Researcher can directly approach to the source where information is available and carry on his research work. If we know where the information is available in the secondary data, he can directly go there and he can collect the information. He need not meet each and every respondents. He need not travel so many kilometers to collect the information. Next one is, it is quite economical. So when compared to primary data, it is quite economical because it saves lot of time as well as money. Many times the researcher need not appoint enumerators. Whereas in case of primary data, so I have told you the researcher has to be very skilled person because he has to collect the raw data from the respondents. So it's not an easy task to collect the information. For that he has to appoint some skilled enumerators or the skilled person to collect the information. But in case of secondary data, there is no appointment of enumerators to collect the data. There is no training cost. So training cost need not be given to the enumerators and other field staff. On account of this factor, it is said that secondary data collection is economical. Now why it is economical? Because here under secondary data, the researcher need not appoint a skilled person to collect the information. But in primary data, of course, the information collection is very difficult. In that situation, what happens? The researcher has to appoint a skilled person to collect the information. Next one is, it is more reliable because the information is stored in documents. So it will be stored in the form of document and it is very easy to access also. The information is credible also. Most of the data consist of the data collected by the government from different department under its control. So, most of the data will be available in the government websites itself, because the government will collect lot of information from the various department. For example, population census data obtained from the head of the government departments under authority is more credible. Therefore, secondary data is a good source for carrying research work. So, here secondary data is the best method to carry out the research work, because most of the information will already be collected by some other organizations. For example, here government will collect lot of information of various departments. So, if we consult that particular website, we can get all the departments information. So, it is a more economical source also. Next, this source of data helps to draw conclusion on account of various advantages it provides to the researcher. So, under this method, we are able to draw the conclusions. So, because we know what is the exact data we have collected, so it is easy to draw the conclusions. Next, coming to the disadvantages of secondary data. So, let us see what are the disadvantages here. So, the information may have been collected long ago. So, they are telling that there may be a chances of outdated information also, which will be taken by the researcher, thereby it affects the research activity. But in case of primary data, all the fresh data will be available. So, the current issues will be discussed with the respondents. But in case of this, long ago, a researcher might have studied on a particular topic upon which this particular researcher is going to refer that. So, what happens? The information which is collected long back will be outdated now. So, it thereby affects the research activity. The information may have been collected long ago and may not be applicable to the current situation. So, there are lot of fluctuations or the changes which are going on in the external environment. In that situation, whatever the data which is collected by the researcher may be outdated or it does not holds good for the current situation. So, any research of this kind of data will become worthless. So, working on such type of data which is outdated, so it is useless or it is worthless. Next one is, information has been collected and stored by the government and other organization to serve their respective purpose. Such information may not be useful for the study undertaken by the present researcher. Now, in the advantage, I have told you that government will collect lot of information of various departments, but whether the government will collect all the information, no. Now here, if you see the disadvantage here, government might have collected those information which is needed for them, but it will not help the researcher. Suppose the topic which is relating to the research activity might not be collected by the government, but the researcher have taken that information. So, thereby the research work also goes wrong. So, the government will collect those information which is need for them, but it may not help the researcher sometimes. On account of this, any research on this kind of information may become worthless. So, if we collect such information and do the research activity, it will become useless or worthless. Next one is third point, that is the researcher misinterpret the results even though the data may be correct due to lack of knowledge. Now, the data which has been collected already, it may be correct, but certain times the researcher without knowledge or without knowingly, he might have misinterpreted, in the sense he have misunderstood about that particular topic. So, this will happen under secondary data. Thus, secondary data, though useful, it may not produce good research result due to the wrong method of collection, analysis and interpretation. Now, what happens here? Data which is available might be correct, but how it has been interpreted or how it has been analyzed by the researcher, if it goes wrong, then it will affect the research activity. Next, fourth point, there are chances of faulty collection and storage of data. Therefore, any research on this may give misleading research result. So, there may be a chances that faulty collection. So, here the organization or any other individual who have collected the data is not proper or it is not correct. But the researcher have referred that information to his research work. Here also his research work will go wrong. So, these are the few disadvantages of secondary data. Now, moving on to the next disadvantage, it may be possible to gather this information from an abnormal situation or an exceptional situation. That is, when the researcher wants that, or if it is on an abnormal situation, therefore, decisions made by or made based on that information may be flawed. So, I have told you the information which is collected long back, that is before 10 years, may not be applicable now. In that situation, your research activity will go wrong because the situations before 10 years is totally different now. So, it will not be suitable for the researcher to do his research work. Next one is lack of adequacy of statistical information. Many times statistical information may not be fully available. So, there may be a chances that all the statistical information which is required by the researcher is not available certain times. In that situation, so the research work cannot be completed properly. Therefore, any result from this kind of research is not satisfactory. So, if you see this disadvantage here, so the research information or the information what the researcher is going to collect, so it should be available in the correct time. So, suppose if the researcher wants the information of last 5 years, but it is not available in time, then the research activity goes wrong. And if you see the next disadvantage, that is the statistical information what the individual or organization have collected before, it may not be in full. In that situation, your research activity will also be incomplete research activity. So, these are the few disadvantages of secondary data. Now, we shall see what are the difference between primary data as well as secondary data. Already we have discussed about primary as well as secondary. Now, we shall see what is the difference between them. So, the first one is primary data is original in character. So, I have already told you here the researcher is going to collect the information for the first time. So, you will get the fresh data. So, it is original in character, whereas secondary data is not original because it has been already collected by some other person and the researcher is going to refer that data. Next, second one, collection of data is expensive in case of primary data. Of course, I have told you here the researcher is going to collect individually from all the respondents. So, it is expensive. At the same time, it is time consuming also. But secondary data is less expensive because you can directly get the ready-made data through this secondary sources. Next difference, primary data is in the shape of raw material. So, you are going to collect for the first time, so it will be in the shape of raw material where it has been not interpreted, where it has been not analyzed. So, it is like a raw material, okay. Whereas secondary data is in the shape of finished goods where it will be collected by some other person already. So, he will collect that, he will analyze and he had interpreted that information. But this will not happen in case of primary data. All the information will be raw. At the same time, it requires much skill for the researcher to collect that information because he has to collect properly. At the same time, he has to analyze each and every information. At the same time, it has to be interpreted to the users. Next one is primary data is adequate and suitable. So, primary data is more adequate and suitable when compared to secondary data. So, depending upon the situation of the researcher can collect the information, that is primary data. But secondary data, they are the ready-made data. So, according to the researcher's wish, he can't collect the information. So, secondary data need not be adequate in certain situations. So, in all the situations, all the information of the secondary data may not be suitable for the researcher. In that situation, it will be difficult for him because the exact information what the researcher wants may not be available through secondary sources. Then he has to go for primary sources where it requires lot of time to collect the data. So these are the difference between primary data as well as secondary data. So if you know what is the meaning as well as advantage and disadvantages of primary data as well as secondary data, you will be able to segregate or you will be able to distinguish the difference between both the types, that is both the methods. So in my next session, I am going to discuss the next topic, that is survey and questionnaire. So my dear students, in today's session we have learnt what is primary data, what is secondary data, what are the advantages as well as disadvantages of primary as well as secondary data, and what are the main difference between primary as well as secondary data. So these are all about the sources of data collection. So in my next session, I am going to discuss individually, that is what is survey and what is questionnaire. Okay. So my dear students, hope you all understood today's session. See you all in my next session with a new topic. Till then, take care. Thank you.